Hello, my name is Kristen Dutcher. I'm the Clinical Assistant Professor of Business Law at Kennesaw State University in Kennesaw, Georgia, United States. I'm here to talk to you today about inclusion through balanced reflections. When I say reflections, this refers to test reflections or post-exam wrappers, which is a metacognitive reflection that students can do after taking a test to think about how did they perform on the test and how did they prepare for the test. I'm going to show you how I use a form of these reflections to help inclusion in my classroom. But first, a little story. So in the spring of 2020, I realized that I had some implicit biases against a certain type of students. And this is an important part of the inclusive classroom. Teachers examining their own beliefs and rejecting those which are negative or harmful. The type of student I was biased against was what I called the non-participant. The student who sits way in the back of a large classroom, occasionally attends, never asks questions or participates, and sometimes looks like they're sleeping. A particular student was behaving this way in the spring of 2020, and I felt myself writing them off as lazy and apathetic. However, when the student began to complete test reflections that same semester, I realized that they were struggling. This was a student who was a first-generation college student and was nervous about being in school. They were shy and withdrawn by nature, and they had been receiving a lot of negative messaging from friends that they couldn't get college done. They wouldn't be able to succeed. So all of these things were beating down upon them and making it very difficult for them to succeed. However, when I use reflections, I use balanced reflections, which ask the students to focus on what did they do well in the preparation of a test. And for this particular student, that focus helped to increase their confidence, helped them to become more motivated to continue to progress through the semester, and was, in their words, a game changer. So although they started off my semester very rough, I worked together with the student and we were able to help them move from barely passing to an A at the end of the semester. So there was personal growth for this individual student, but there was also personal growth for me in reminding myself the importance of recognizing our implicit biases and fighting against them. That's the important first step in an inclusive classroom. Now, I began using the traditional form of test reflections in the fall of 2017. Traditionally, test reflections ask students to look at what needs to be improved in the test-taking process. In the spring of 2019, however, I read an article in the Harvard Business Review magazine called The Feedback Fallacy by Buckingham and Goodall. These authors talk first about the trend in the workplace of giving constructive criticism as the only form of feedback. In other words, feedback is supposed to be used only for correcting mistakes. And these authors argue that it's actually the employees who receive positive reinforcement of what they're already doing well, who are the employees that continue to excel the most. Now, we had just completed a test reflection before I read this article, and my brain seemed to connect the two together. And I thought, well, if employees will excel more when you give them both positive reinforcement and constructive criticism, why wouldn't our students also excel? So in the fall of 2019, I began using these balanced test reflections. And here's a prompt for a balanced test reflection. It focuses only on what did a student do well in both the preparation of and the taking of a test. It also asks students, how can you expand on what you did well and continue to carry that with you throughout the semester? What I've found is I don't even need to ask students what they need to improve on. That naturally is part of the conversation of reflection after they have completed talking about what they did well. I have very few students who make 100% on my tests. So most students know if they didn't make 100%, something could be improved, and they start to discuss that. Then at the very end of the semester, I have students answer this fifth question, which you see in bold, asking them what do they prefer to focus on? What they did well in preparation and performance of a test, or what they did poorly? Which one do they find more motivating? So here's an example of what I might receive, and this is a screenshot of my learning management system, a digital platform where students can submit their test reflections to me electronically. They're very short. I only require 200 words, and this is an extra credit project, so not every student completes one. But typically, as you see in this example, which I wrote as a student for you, the students start talking about what they did well. Then they might have questions about why they're not doing 100% well and what could they improve. Sometimes the students will recognize what they need to improve on their own. Other times they will ask me, do I have any insight as to what they could do to improve? And so a very important part of using balanced test reflections in the inclusive classroom is over here on the right side of your screen, the ability for teachers to give feedback. Now in my digital system, I can give feedback in a written or audio form. And since it's a little hard to see here, I've copied the feedback for you on the next slide. So the feedback is an incredible opportunity for me to talk with and communicate with every single learner on an individual basis. I teach very large classes, 100 students. So it's difficult to connect with each and every one of those unless you're using a tool like this. Since not every student completes a test reflection because of its extra credit status, it's easy for me to respond to those that do. I always start out by encouraging them, agreeing with them that there are things that they're doing right. I mean, they didn't get a 0 on the test, so something is going right. And I congratulate them on that. Then I give my suggestions, if they've asked for them or not. What do I see that might be a helpful improvement for them? Is there a resource that they are missing that they're not taking a look at? Is there time or test taking strategies that would help them? So I'll list those things out, and they're different from learner to learner. But being able to connect with each learner individually helps each student to be seen and heard, which is an important part of the inclusive classroom. I always end my feedback too with, let's continue this discussion. Let me know if it works for you. Let me know if you have any questions. Please continue to reach out for me. So it's never set and a set conversation. The feedback is an invitation to continue the conversation throughout the semester. Now, taking a look at some of the data that I've collected from the 2019-2020 academic year, you see here a bar graph of the reflection response rates that I received. So the first bar in each semester, the one colored in blue, is the total number of students who submitted a reflection. Because this is an extra credit, normally this is between 40 and 60% of the class overall. And the fall 2019 and summer 2020 total submission rate followed that trend. In the spring of 2020, however, the total submission rate was much lower, and I attribute this to COVID-19. The spring of 2020 was when the United States first went into lockdown over the pandemic. It was when our university switched from in-person classes to 100% virtual or online classes within a matter of days, and this was a traumatic event for the students. It was a difficult end of the semester for them, and I think that's why less test reflections were submitted. Of those that were submitted, you can then see in the second bar of each semester on the orange graph, the number of students who submitted question number 5 response. Now, question number 5, sometimes the students don't get to that because they've already completed their 200-word count, and so they don't need to use the last question. But for those students that did answer question number 5, and again, this was about preferences. Do you prefer to look at what you did well on a test or what you did poorly? When we look at those particular students, we can see that overwhelmingly the students want to focus on at least some positivity. We had 42% of those students who answered question number 5 in that academic year who wanted just to focus on what they did well. That was their preference. Then we had 37% of the students who wanted a balance between what did they do well and what could they improve on. We also have a small subset of students, 21% in that particular year, who just want to focus on what was negative. What did they do wrong and how could they improve? And here are some sample comments from where this data came from. An example of a student who wants to focus on the negative says they like to reflect on their deficiencies so that they can find solutions to them. They're problem solvers. A student who wants to focus just on the positive says, it's not motivating to look at what you did poorly. I'd rather focus on what I did well. And a student who wants to focus on a balance between the two suggests starting off by focusing on what you did well as a form of encouragement, and then looking at what you did wrong so you know what you need to change. And I agree with all of these statements. I think there's benefit in looking at both the positive and the negative. And so to appease all learners, the balanced test reflection comes into play. Students can look at what they did well to encourage themselves and motivate themselves to continue, and then also talk about what they did poorly if they'd like to learn from their mistakes and try to improve. So next we can take a look at how balanced reflections meet the literature that exists about the concepts of inclusive teaching, and specifically as it regards to what teachers can do in an inclusive classroom. So from Florian and Black Hawkins in 2011, teachers should constantly seek out and try new things to support all learners. That's why I created Balanced Reflections, because I thought it would be a more supportive system to all the learners in our classroom, those that want to look at what they did well in the preparation of a test, and those who want to look at what they can improve. Again, from Florian and this time Spratt in 2013, teachers should reject deterministic beliefs about ability as being fixed. This is an important part of the feedback process. I will occasionally get students who will have very deterministic, dead set opinions about themselves, usually in the negative. Things like, I can't learn this discipline, or I'm not a good test taker, or I have bad test anxiety. When those kinds of statements come up, I challenge them strongly in my feedback, reminding students that ability is never fixed. We can always find something that works for you, your individual needs, as a way to help you to progress in the classroom. Might take a little bit more work, but I always express my openness and willingness to work with the student to find what that thing is to help them along. I've also planted a lot of resources on both study strategies and test taking techniques, as well as personal issues such as test anxiety and stress. I've planted those in my digital classroom so that students can always refer back to those resources whenever they need them, and I will often reference them in my Balanced Reflections feedback. From 2015, it's important teachers are communicating belief in their learners about their competence, both in word and deed. Again, this is where feedback comes into play. You can record or you can write feedback to the students expressing your belief in them. And sometimes that's all it takes, is somebody who believes in them and believes that they can do well for the learners to have the encouragement, have the motivation to progress. And finally, from 2019, teachers should focus on what learners can do in the inclusive classroom. That's the importance of the positive aspect of Balanced Reflections. It reminds learners, hey, you did okay. There are things you did well here. There are things you can do. So let's start off by addressing those, highlighting those to give you some encouragement to move forward. After we've established that and you have some confidence built up, then we can talk about what mistakes you might have made and how you can improve those going forward. So as you can see, Balanced Reflections is a helpful tool for use in the inclusive classroom. I would love to hear your comments and questions if you have them regarding balanced teaching reflections. You can certainly address those to me at the email address listed here. I appreciate your attention to this video. Thanks.